Most of us grow up with a certain picture of the Bible in our minds, a world of familiar Sunday school scenes, animals filing into an ark two by two, a young shepherd boy facing down a warrior with a sling, angels appearing in bright, reassuring light. It is all, in a way, comfortingly recognizable. But if you read closely, there are places where that familiar world goes slightly out of focus. Brief, unsettling lines that appear and disappear almost at once, never fully explained, as if a curtain lifts just long enough to show something we were not quite meant to see. One of those moments is only a single verse before the story of Noah's flood really begins. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, a passing reference to strange beings called the Nephilim. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, the text says, and also afterward. And then, almost as an afterthought, it links them with the sons of God, who came into the daughters of men. Who were they? Giants? Fallen angels' children? Legendary warriors? The Bible never quite spells it out. It is as though the author nods in the direction of a story that everyone once knew, and then calmly continues on to the flood. That, to my mind, is where things already become a bit uncanny. When a text as economical as Genesis wastes not a word and still chooses not to explain, you start to suspect that there is more going on. We will get into that in a bit. For now, imagine you are stepping quietly into the stacks of a very old library. Somewhere between the shelves labeled Flood Narratives and Angelology, there is a thin folder marked Nephilim. It is not very thick, but it contains some of the strangest material in the whole biblical archive. Let us start with what we actually know, or at least what the canonical text actually says. In Genesis, the Nephilim appear just before the description of a world spiraling into violence and corruption. The Hebrew word itself probably comes from a root meaning to fall, which has led to translations like fallen ones, or, more aggressively, those who fall upon others. Ancient Greek translators, perhaps unsure what to do with it, simply rendered it as giants. Already, you can feel the ambiguity. Are these giants physically enormous or just terrifyingly powerful? Are they fallen in the sense of moral collapse or in the sense of beings that have fallen from heaven? The other place they appear by name is much later, in the book of Numbers, when Israelite spies return from scouting the land of Canaan. They report having seen the Nephilim and add that we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes and we looked the same to them. It is a dramatic way to describe feeling outmatched, but was it meant literally? That is one of the questions that keeps scholars busy. This is where things diverge. By the time Jewish and Christian interpreters of late antiquity and the Middle Ages started wrestling with the Nephilim, they were already dealing with a very small dataset. Those two brief biblical passages, supported by a handful of related references to unusual peoples, such as the Anakim, the Rephaim, and the Emim. And yet, from that tiny beginning, entire cosmologies unfolded. One line of interpretation, very old and quite influential, reads the sons of God in Genesis 6 as angels who broke the boundary between heaven and earth. In this view, the Nephilim are literally their offspring, hybrid beings, part divine and part human, whose violence helped fill the world with wickedness before the flood. This is the story that is expanded in books like 1st Enoch and Jubilees, Jewish writings composed in the last few centuries before the time we now call the 1st century. 1st Enoch speaks of a group of angels called the Watchers, who descend to earth, take wives, and beget towering children who devour not only human food but, eventually, human beings. When their hunger grows insatiable, they begin to consume each other. It is a grisly picture, and it greatly amplifies the brief hints of Genesis. The Book of Jubilees, written in roughly the 2nd century before Christ, recasts the narrative slightly, adding further generations beyond the Nephilim and giving names, genealogies, and cosmic consequences to the whole episode. By the time you reach the lower levels of this particular iceberg, you are firmly in the territory of full mythic cycles, heavenly councils, oaths on Mount Hermon, and angels bound in darkness until the Last Judgment. What is interesting is that, for many early Jews and Christians, this was not simply entertaining extra reading. Church fathers such as Justin Martyr in the 2nd century and Tertullian in the late 2nd and early 3rd century seemed quite comfortable with the idea that fallen angels had produced monstrous offspring. In their world, The barrier between visible and invisible was already permeable. The Nephilim story simply supplied a particularly vivid illustration. But here is where it gets complicated. Another influential interpretation, especially in later Christian theology, rejects the angelic reading altogether. By the time of St. Augustine, writing in the early 5th century, there is a strong preference for understanding the sons of God as human, specifically the godly descendants of Adam's son Seth, who supposedly intermarried with the unrighteous line of Cain. In this Sethite reading, the Nephilim are not supernatural hybrids at all, but simply the offspring of mixed marriages between the faithful and the unfaithful. Still impressive, perhaps, but fully human. Why the shift? Partly, it seems, out of concern for maintaining a clearer separation between angels and humans. Councils and theologians in the early centuries of the church spent a surprising amount of time defining what angels could and could not do. By the medieval period, many theologians were firmly convinced that pure spirits could not, in any ordinary sense, produce children with human women. The older Watcher stories were quietly pushed to the side or reinterpreted as metaphor. If you go into a medieval monastery library in, say, the 12th century, you are likely to find Augustine's explanation copied in a neat hand, while Enoch sits, if it is present at all, in a more obscure corner. Officially, the Nephilim were now tall, wicked people, not semi-divine monstrosities. And yet, if you look at the margins of European religious culture, the older fascination never completely disappears. Medieval bestiaries and world chronicles, from Britain to Central Europe, sometimes include references to giant races living at the edges of the map. Pilgrims are shown stones or bones that are said to have belonged to biblical giants. Relic culture, which loved concreteness, could not resist the idea that a saint might pray atop the very skull of one of Goliath's kin. More on that later. Before we follow those relics, we should meet a few of the other names that cluster around the Nephilim in the Bible itself. In the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua, as Israel enters Canaan, we are briefly introduced to several peoples described as unusually large. The Anakim, associated in one passage with the Nephilim, the Rephaim, a shadowy group spread across several regions, the Emim, the Zamzumim, and others. Sometimes they are simply great and tall. Sometimes their lands are said to be full of fortified cities, up to heaven. There is King Og of Bashan, whose bedstead is carefully measured in Deuteronomy as 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, roughly 4 meters in length. The detail is strangely domestic, almost bureaucratic, as if the author is pointing to a piece of royal furniture in a museum catalog. You can see it in Rabbah of the Ammonites, he adds, as though inviting ancient tourists to a giant's bedroom. Then there is Goliath of Gath, perhaps the most famous of them all. In some manuscripts of 1 Samuel, he stands at 6 cubits and a span, close to 3 meters by modern calculations. In others, notably among the Dead Sea Scrolls, he is listed as 4 cubits and a span, around 2 meters. To us, that might sound like a tall basketball player rather than a monster. To an Iron Age soldier, whose average height was much lower, it would have been imposing enough. I have always found these differing measurements quietly telling. They hint that even in antiquity, giant was a flexible category sliding between the literally huge and the merely overwhelming. It may be less about a tape measure and more about how small someone makes you feel. That sense of being dwarfed, morally, militarily, spiritually, runs all through these stories. The Israelites, fresh from slavery, see themselves as grasshoppers. David, a youth, faces a veteran champion in heavy armor. The point, theologically, is that victory belongs not to size but to divine favor, yet the stories continue to circle those intimidating figures as if the human imagination cannot quite let go of the idea that there were once people who simply outclassed us in stature as in strength. Now, this may sound like the end of the story. A few ancient references, some later legends, a handful of debated measurements, and a tidy moral about faith overcoming fear. But this is where things turn darker and, in a modern way, stranger. From the 19th century onward, as archaeology and geology developed into serious sciences, people went looking for the Nephilim in the ground. Reports began to surface, some in newspapers, others in traveling exhibitions, of giant skeletons unearthed in remote valleys or uncovered in riverbeds. Photographs, usually badly retouched, showed men with shovels standing beside skulls larger than their torsos. Again and again, experts investigated, and again, the remains turned out to be misidentified animal bones, elaborate hoaxes, or, in more recent decades, digital manipulations. There is, at present, no solid archaeological evidence for an entire race of gigantic humans of the sort imagined by the most extravagant readings of Genesis. In a field where even an unusually tall burial can be documented to the centimeter, the Nephilim have remained, unhelpfully, invisible. And yet, the stories of suppressed, giant bones and hidden museum collections continue to circulate, particularly online. The idea that powerful institutions might be concealing physical proof of biblical giants fits very neatly into a certain modern mood of suspicion. In a way, it is a late echo of medieval relic culture, an intense desire to have something you can point to and say, there, that skull, that femur, that bedstead, those prove it really happened. We will talk about this later in the iceberg. For now, notice the pattern. In the ancient world, later Jewish writers filled in the gaps Genesis had left with rich mythic detail. In the patristic era, theologians argued over angels and humans and what sort of bodies they had. In the Middle Ages, relics and local legends tried to make the stories tangible. In the modern period, photographs and spurious digs took up the same role. In each age, people have tried to drag the Nephilim from the margins of the text into the center of their own lived reality. What if, instead, we treat their elusiveness as part of the point? Even within the Bible, the Nephilim are liminal figures. They appear in those days and also afterward, hovering on the boundary between the antediluvian world and history as we know it. They sit at the edge of maps and at the edge of memory. The flood in Genesis is not just about water, it is about a kind of cosmic reset, a closing of certain doors. The Nephilim belong to that sealed-off corridor, that before which cannot quite be revisited. That may be why the text does not give us much. Just enough to know that something transgressive happened, something involving power, sexuality, and boundaries between heaven and earth. The details remain offstage. We are told their violence filled the world. We are told they were heroes of old, men of renown. We are not given their biographies. And so later readers, from the authors of First Enoch to conspiracy theorists in the 2020s, keep trying to supply what the Bible withholds. They want names, heights, graves, maps. They want the unsettling made solid. At the same time, there is a quieter, more symbolic way to read the whole business, and it is worth mentioning before we finish. Interpreters who downplay the literal giants often see in the Nephilim a kind of narrative, shorthand for human societies going badly wrong. When power is worshipped for its own sake, when elites become predatory, when those who should protect instead fall upon the weak. In that reading, the Nephilim represent not a separate species, but a familiar possibility within our own. We do not need 10-foot-tall warriors to devastate a world. Ordinary human beings, given enough power and disregard, can manage that quite efficiently. Whether one finds that explanation reassuring or more disturbing is a matter of taste. In the end, the Nephilim occupy a curious place, too strange to be tamed entirely by moralizing, too deeply embedded in ancient religion to be dismissed as a modern fantasy, and yet too faint in the surviving sources to be pinned down as historical fact. We circle back, then, to that question. Why do we care so much? Perhaps it has something to do with our need for physical connection to the stories we inherit. Pilgrims kiss the stone of a martyr's shrine. Modern tourists photograph a rock said to be Goliath's. Online audiences share images of impossible skeletons. It is not enough to hear that once there were giants. We want to stand where they stood, measure ourselves against their beds, or their armor, or at least their legend. Underneath that, I suspect, lies a quieter hope that if we can touch the past, then the world we read about in ancient texts is not entirely gone. That there really were days when the boundary between heaven and earth seemed thinner, when angels might walk in the cool of the evening, and when, for better or worse, human beings were part of something larger and stranger than the modern eye can see. The Nephilim, frustratingly vague as they are, sit right on that fault line between history and myth, faith and curiosity. They remind us how much of our religious imagination depends on brief, suggestive phrases and the long shadows they cast. Perhaps it is fitting that we do not have their bones in a glass case, labeled with a date and a cubit conversion. They remain where they started, a few unsettling words on a thin piece of parchment, inviting us to wonder what walked the earth in those days and also afterward. Thank you for walking through this with me. Wherever you land, literal giants, symbolic powers, or something in between, I hope the next time you pass that strange verse in Genesis, you pause for a moment and let the silence around the Nephilim speak.